last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. It's a book that many of us avoid because it's full of unusual symbolism and metaphors that are very confusing and alarming. And a lot of people have done very strange things with the book of Revelation over the years. And we're going to be talking about some of those things today. We're in like a part 2 message. Part 1 was last week, as we are in like the center of the book of Revelation. Last week we read from chapter 12 and we talked about spiritual darkness. The fact that we as a human race and we as Christians have a spiritual enemy that the Bible calls the Satan, the accuser, or the ancient serpent who deceives the whole world. We have an enemy who tries to accuse and deceive God's people. This week we're going to carry on part 2 of that message to consider our enemy's strategy. How the devil often works throughout human history in a macro level, the way that he makes life hard for God's people and for the church. And we're going to look at and invite you to what John calls a call to endurance. John's message, the heart of what we're talking about today, is a call to endure. If you're a Christian, if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you know that it's hard. If it isn't hard right now, it will get hard. At some point in your life, it can be difficult to follow Jesus, and we need to encourage one another to endure, to keep going. And as I was preparing for this, I remembered the time that I got my first car and started driving as a 20-year-old around towns. And it coincided with the time that I became a Christian, actually. And as a new Christian, I was very excited about being a Christian and following Jesus. I wanted to tell the whole world about Jesus. So I thought, I'm going to use my car to signal to the world that I'm a Christian. And so I did 2 things. One is I marked my car. I branded it with a fish logo, which in hindsight wasn't the wisest thing to do, but I did it because I wanted to tell everybody I'm a Christian. And if my driving's bad, blame Jesus. And I also bought a bumper sticker. And this bumper sticker, at the time, I thought this was really cool. But looking back now, I think it says more about how lack of cool I am. But the bumper sticker read, Heaven Bound. And I put it on my car and drove around in this car that said, Heaven Bound. And again, it's probably said more about my driving. But those 2 things, that I was marked with a fish and I was bound for heaven, we'll see as being 2 things that John says to the church to help encourage them. Namely, your identity is that you've been marked by Jesus, and your home is heaven. That if you're a Christian, you're not an earth dweller. Instead, you're seated in the heavenly places. It's what the Bible says. So we're going to read from Revelation chapter 13, and we'll just read it through once, and then we'll walk through it a bit and talk about it. We'll kick off where we ended last week. The dragon, it's the symbol of Satan. The dragon stood on the sand of the sea, which is like dun dun dun. And here it comes. And then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads. On its horns were 10 crowns, and on its heads were blasphemous names. The beast I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. The dragon gave the beast his power, his throne, and his authority, which is a reference to the heads, horns, and crowns. One of its heads appeared to be fatally wounded, but its fatal wound was healed. Now the whole earth was amazed and followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon because he gave authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to wage war against it? The beast was given a mouth to utter boasts and blasphemies. It was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Remember that number 42, 3.5 years, times and a half. We said last week was a symbolic period of trial and persecution for God's people. And it's the age that we live in now. It's an age that John calls the 3.5 years, a time of trial and difficulty. So this beast was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. And then it began to speak blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his dwelling, those who dwell in heaven. And it was permitted to wage war against the saints and to conquer them. It was also given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All those who live on the earth will worship it, and everyone whose name was not written from the foundations of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slaughtered. If anyone has ears to hear, let him listen. If anyone is to be captive, to be taken captive, into captivity he goes. If anyone is to be killed with a sword he shall be killed. This calls for endurance and faithfulness from the saints. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and compels the earth and those who live in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. It also performs great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in front of people. It deceives those who live on the earth because of the signs that it is permitted to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who live on the earth to make an image of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. It was permitted to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could both speak and cause whoever would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And it makes everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has this mark, the beast's name or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, because it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. And then I looked, and there was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 444,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. This is the word of God. It's quite clear, isn't it? Should we get the band up and sing? There's a lot in there, a lot of unusual symbols, quite dramatic scenes, and some things that we go, oh, I've heard of that before. That number 666, I'm familiar with that. That appears in popular culture from time to time. And oh, I've heard people talk about the mark of the beast. So there's lots in here, some familiar, some unfamiliar, and we're going to talk about it together. Let me just say this: that both we'll start with a macro overview. And then we'll look at the number of the beast, and then we'll come in to answer the question and consider, how is it that we are meant to endure then? What's John trying to say? And because it is that we're to endure that is the central point of what John's writing here. We read it in chapter 13, verse 10, where he says, this calls for endurance and faithfulness from the saints. He makes it clear, what I'm telling you calls for endurance. Your response to hearing this, church, is supposed to be endurance. And then actually in chapter 14, we're not going to read the whole thing, but chapter 14 tells much the same story as chapter 13, except it tells it from heaven, and so uses angels instead of earth beast and land sea beast to communicate the same truth. And the center of chapter 14 is in verse 12, where again it says, this calls for endurance from the saints, from those who keep God's command and their faith in Jesus. So the center point of what we're talking about is this, the call for endurance. Let's step back, though, back into chapter 13 and consider what we're reading and what's in front of us. So the dragon, as we saw last week, is this image of spiritual darkness, the Satan and the accuser. And he gives authority to a sea beast. And then we have a land beast who speaks like a dragon. And so both of these things, the land beast and the sea beast, are meant to be, we're meant to understand that they are empowered and animated and influenced by Satan, by the dragon, spiritual darkness. So we'll start with the first one. There is a beast, we're told, who comes out of the sea. We must always try to ground what we're reading in its original context, in its original day and age and setting. John is writing this as an Israelite Jew who knew what it was to have a beast come from across the sea and devour his people. Who's come from across the beast in John? Who's come from across the sea in John's day? The answer, the Roman Empire. The sea beast is an image of the Roman Empire in John's day, who came out from the sea to conquer and devour the land. Let's walk it through a little bit more, however. He says, the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like bears, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. We've got we've got an amalgamation of different creatures in this one creature. And that amalgamation, if you are familiar with the Old Testament, as John's original readers would have been, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, those three creatures, three beasts, leopard, bear, and lion, you would remember, oh yeah, in Daniel chapter 7, we see much the same thing. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has a vision, and instead of one beast with 3 different parts of animals, he sees 3 separate beasts. He sees a leopard, he sees a bear, and he sees a lion, and he sees one more. And Daniel's told that these beasts are kingdoms that are going to come and conquer and devour the earth for a while. And in Daniel's day, not long after, that's exactly what happened. You had the Babylonian Empire, you had the Assyrian Empire, you had the Greek Empire, and you had the Roman Empire. Those 4 beasts all came together. John is saying what we're experiencing in Rome and in our day is an amalgamation of all of those things. The spirit of empire, we might say, the spirit of imperial state power that comes to conquer and devour, afflict and persecute God's people. What we experienced in history with the Babylonians, Syrians, Greeks and Romans, John wants you to know, church, this is a pattern, this is how the enemy works, and he's coming again. We've said this a lot, but in order to understand letters and books like Revelation, it is hard for us because A, we don't have this kind of literature in our culture, so we're not familiar with what to do with it. But B, unless we're familiar and grounded with passages like Daniel 7, we'll miss a lot of what goes on. You know, the United Bible Society did a survey, and they worked out that of the 405 verses in the book of Revelation, there are 676 different allusions to the Old Testament. That's pretty cool, isn't it? So John is grounded in that, and he's drawing on this imagery to communicate there's a beast, an empire, imperial power that has come, that's like this amalgamation, this coming together of all of these forces that we've seen in the past. And the people say, who is like the beast? The earth dwellers say, who is like the beast? Who can stop the beast? And they go along with and have to get him kind of make terms with the fact that the beast has come. So that's the first one. We're saying it refers to the Roman Empire in John's day, or state power. But then there's a second beast. There's a beast that comes from the land, and this beast looks like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. The reference to a lamb, of course, is a reference to the image of the Christ that we've seen here. What that means and what that symbolizes is that this beast from the land is a parody of religious power, a parody of sacred things. Looks like a lamb, speaks like a dragon. In John's day, it could have referred to the pagan religion around him, but more likely referred to the Judaism of John's day. If you've read the book of Acts, you know that it was the Romans and the Jews together that were persecuting, capturing, and killing the Christians. So John is saying what you're seeing in reality is a type, a pattern of what darkness does and of how the enemy works. Imperial power, religious power come together to capture, kill, persecute, and afflict the church. This calls for endurance, he says to them. This calls for endurance. One of the things I love about Revelation is because it is written in the way that it's written as metaphor, it speaks across times and across cultures. And that's the power of metaphor, as distinct from, say, a simile. I could say, John is like a pig, and it means one thing. Or I could say, John is a pig, and it's even stronger. Or if I assume that you all know who John is, I could just say, that pig. And you know who I'm referring to. This is what's going on here. That beast from the sea, that beast from the land. Sorry, John, no offense to you. What the writer is trying to ground is to say that there is this pattern of how evil works in the world, where often throughout history and in our day, we see a coming together of imperial state power and religious power, and they coalesce and work in partnership to persecute, kill, devour, destroy the church. In John's day, it was Rome and Judaism. In our day and in other parts of history, it's been something else. But it's ever been thus. This is the pattern. In much of the Middle Ages, it was the official church of its day that assisted the state in killing and capturing Christians. There are certain strands of Islam today that does much the same thing. The religious power and state power come together to persecute, capture, and kill God's people. This is how white supremacy has worked. It is religious rationalization used to undergird state power. We saw this in fascism and the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. Of Germany's 16,000 Protestant pastors, 10,000 of them at least supported the Nazis and the rise of the movement. State power and religious power. You saw it in much of communism. In communist Romania under Ceausescu, it was estimated that 90% of all Orthodox priests were employed by the state, coming together of religious and state power to persecute and afflict people, particularly the church. It's not just John's day, in other words. It still happens, has happened throughout history. Even in our nation, religious rationalization starts to get used to justify and strengthen support for state policies. And when we see that happening, John says it calls for endurance, but he also says it calls for wisdom. And then he says, it calls for wisdom. Let the reader understand I'm referring to the beast, wink, wink, whose number is 666. So let's talk about that for a bit, because that's a number that often confuses many people. What is this number all about? Well, do you remember when, I don't know if it was true in your day, but in my day, back in my day, when I went to school, people, particularly girls I have to say, would often play games with words and numbers for fun. And so there was one game in particular that girls in my class would often play, where they would write a boy's name, then they would write loves and write a girl's name. And then they would look for letters in the boy's name that were also in the word loves, and letters in the girl's name that were also in the word loves, and they would add them all up until they arrived at a number, and then that number was supposed to mean the compatibility of that couple. Do you remember that game? Does everybody know that game? Yeah, so-and-so, yeah. Amy did it this week with us, with me and her. She thought it'd be fun. Turns out we're only 60% compatible. So that doesn't bode well for our marriage. So we're familiar with this idea of playing games with words and numbers. And in John's day, they also had a similar versions of this, grown-up versions of this, playing games with numbers. They called it gematria, because the alphabets of Greek and Hebrew, each of the letters of the alphabet corresponded to letters in the, each of the letters corresponded to numbers. So a familiar example would be the Latin alphabet and Roman numerals. You know, V is a V, but it also is a 5, depending on what you're doing with it, right? That's how it works. And we have examples of this outside the Bible. So in the city of Pompeii, they found some graffiti written on the wall, and the graffiti reads, "I love her whose number is 545. It's just sweet. There was a woman who obviously knew that they had this arrangement that her name meant 545. And so he could put in code, "I love this woman," unless it was some kind of AI hack from the future and it's a robot he was in love with, but we'll assume it wasn't. And throughout history, people have tried to play with the number 666 to arrive at an answer for who the beast is that we need to be aware of. So throughout history, lots of names have been suggested. Muhammad's name was suggested by one early church father. Hitler has 6 letters in his name. So it must be him. Various popes have been called the beast of 666, as has one world government. People think, that's what it refers to. Napoleon, they played with the letters of his name, say, his number must mean 666. It happens throughout history. In fact, I had this leaflet put through my door. Chuck us that, Chris. Some of you, particularly if you live in Seaford, may have had this leaflet put through your door as well. It's like a 4-page, like front and back, full color print that is trying to relay events in Revelation with current world history events, telling me who to watch out for, who the mark of the beast refers to. And I mention it because there was one section that caught my eye. This person who wrote this, they used the letters of the Latin alphabet and played with the numbers of that alphabet to arrive at the number 666. And they worked out that in Latin, 666 means vicarius filii Dei, which refers to a representation of the Son of God, which they say means that the beast, the Antichrist, is the Pope. And they've worked it out. They're putting letters through your door. So this is who the beast is. We've worked it out. The trouble is, John didn't write in Latin, and his readers didn't read it in Latin. He wrote in Greek and Hebrew. So if we arrive at an answer for a code that we think we've cracked, that the original readers would never have understood, we have to, at the very least, hold that very lightly and carefully. I personally, in the way that we've been going through Revelation, I don't think the right way to read Revelation is to treat it like a historical horoscope that predicts future world events. And the reason I don't think that I feel uncomfortable with that is because it's far too easy to just cherry pick your own history or your own period. Someone's on the phone, might be the beast. Depends who it is now, I've probably just accidentally offended someone. It's very easy to just cherry pick events from history and say, this means this. And every generation and every part of the world assumes that this is speaking about them. And so if you're living in Indonesia, you're going to come up with people that you think this must be about. If you're living in Western Europe, you're going to come up with people that you think it's about. And I think we need to be very careful with that. John writes about this in such a way that he expects his readers to know who he means. He says, this calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate. So he is inviting you to do some calculations. He says, the number of the beast, and in Hebrew, the word for beast adds up to, if you play the game, adds up to 666. He says the number for the beast, 666, because it is the number of a person, he says. And that person's number is 666. Well, given that the land beast, we're saying, is the Roman Empire, and the most notorious persecutor of the Christians in the day was Caesar Nero. Well, if you take Caesar Nero, spelt with an N, as he commonly was, and you transpose that into Hebrew, and then play the game of Gematria, you again arrive at 666. So the beast in Hebrew and Caesar Neron in Hebrew arrives at 666. Some of you will notice as well that there's a footnote in your Bible if you're reading it on paper. And the footnote says at the bottom, other Greek manuscripts read 616. 616, not 666. Well, then if you play the same game that we've just played with Hebrew, but this time play it with the Greek alphabet, which is what his readers would have written as well. Well, the word for of the beast, you arrive at 616. And if you use Caesar Nero without the N, because in Greek they wouldn't have written it that way, if you write Caesar Nero in Greek, again you arrive at 616. It seems clear. That's all I can say. It seems clear to me that whether you spoke Hebrew or Greek, you would have understood John saying the beast is Caesar Nero. The point that he's trying to drive home, and the reason for all of this, is he's trying to say to the church, you need courage and you need faithfulness. Beware totalitarian leaders, he says, remember Nero. Beware totalitarian leaders, totalitarian governments, and remember Nero. This calls for wisdom. Wherever you see the rise of a totalitarian state and the coming together of religious power to reinforce that state, John says, remember Nero, be wise, be careful, endure. And you see this occurring not just throughout history, but around the world today. I was talking to a dear member of the church from India last week, Garima, and she was telling me about the rise of totalitarianism in India, combined with an aggressive, state-reinforcing militant Hinduism that is persecuting Christians. Pastors are getting imprisoned and killed, and churches are getting burnt down. Remember Nero. Talk to friends of ours from Nigeria, and they've often talked to me about or shown me videos or pictures of what's going on in their country, where you see the coming together of the state and religion in militant Islam, where Christians are being imprisoned and killed. This sort of thing didn't just happen in the past. It happens all over the world. Remember Nero. Beware totalitarian states. And we need to be awake to it in our day as well. What's being called the rise of soft totalitarianism in England. Something we need to watch out for. Particularly when we see parts of the church start to use religious rationalization for things in Scripture, for things that the state is trying to say that no Christian before has ever enforced or endorsed. It calls for wisdom when comedians are being arrested for telling jokes. It calls for wisdom when people are being blocked from promotion in their workplace because they refuse to wear a certain symbol, or they refuse to repeat or support a particular ideology that the state and parts of the church have said that we must do. It calls for wisdom. It calls for Christians to endure in difficult times. And it calls for wisdom because it's not something you can just have a one-size-fits-all answer for everything. Christians are called to be those who stay awake. They don't become paranoid, but they stay awake. And there are certain circumstances where Christians have to say this far and no further. Or Christians need to be willing to say, I will do and say this and bear the consequences. And that's what it means to follow Jesus. Has throughout history, has in many parts of the world. So the question we then arrive at, having looked at the kind of macro overview of the land beast and the sea beast, considered what the number's really supposed to be all about, the question we have to ask is, how do we endure? How are we then to live in light of all this? And that's an important question. To help with that, let's come back to the central statement, or the central verse that John repeats. He says, this calls for endurance and faithfulness from the saints. The saints. And in using that term, we're reminded who we are as the Christians. If you are a Christian, you are a saint. You are a holy one. Taking this further, John also refers to the church as being not land dwellers, but heavenly dwellers. In Ephesians chapter 2, if we find that slide and put it up, the Apostle Paul says this, that he has raised us up with him and has seated us with him in the heavens in Christ Jesus. Your identity, if you're a Christian, is that you are a seated in heaven one. And some of you will have experienced this. Many of us do. When you become a Christian and put your faith in Jesus, you suddenly feel slightly as though you're not at home in the world in the way that you used to feel at home in the world. You used to just go along with everything and think it was all brilliant. And then suddenly you become a Christian, you find yourself going, I don't love those same things anymore. I have a desire and an appetite in me that nothing in my culture seems to understand. Well, C.S. Lewis says, if you find within yourself an appetite that nothing in this world is ever able to satisfy, it's an indication that you weren't built for this world. You know, because if you've experienced thirst, that tells you there's such a thing as water. If you experience hunger, that points to the fact that there is such a thing as food. But if you sense within yourself a longing for a home that isn't this one, it points to the fact that that is indeed your home. Let's go to the next verse, the next slide, Kev. In Ephesians 1, he says that he's called us to be holy and blameless. And then the next slide. And in 2 Corinthians, it says, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old has passed away, and see, the new has come. Christian, your identity is that you're new. Your identity is that you're his. Your identity is that you're holy. Your identity is that this isn't your home, you belong there. And to endure, you need to know who you are. Because if you forget who you are, you'll listen to anybody who'll tell you who you are. There's a famous story of Margaret Thatcher once visiting a care home for dementia patients. And she went round and met some of the patients, and she shook the hand of one lady, a dementia patient, and she said to the lady, hello dear, do you know who I am? And the woman said, no dear, but if you ask the staff, they usually do. So many Christians live with a kind of temporary amnesia. We forget who we are and we forget where our home is. And so we pin all of our hopes on the governments of this world and the policies of this age, forgetting this is not our home. That we need wisdom to live as Christians. We need wisdom not to become obsessed with trying to understand and crack the code of Revelation. But instead, if there's an obsession to be had, our obsession, our focus must be on what our identity is and where our home is. Because there is coming a day, chapter 14 ends with this, there is coming a day where the Son of Man will pull in the harvest, will take what's his, will bring us to himself. There is coming a day where we will see Jesus face to face. Our faith will be replaced with sight, and who we are will be disclosed to the world. Right now, we believe earth is not our home, heaven is, Christ is. We believe that, but one day there's coming a day where you will see it with your eyes. In the meantime, endure. It's much like when you're having a baby. I've not given birth myself, but I've seen a few experiences of labor, and so I can appreciate it's very hard. But there comes a moment in any labor experience where the woman giving birth is just consumed by the pain, consumed by the trial, and realizes there's no fighting this. I'm just going to have to endure it. I can't keep it at arm's length anymore. I'm going to have to go through it. And at that moment, it's as though they enter like a cave of pain. And it's just difficult and hard. And there's no way out. John says there's been times like that in the church. And there will be times like that again in the church, where it's just hard following Jesus and you need to endure. But what you're focused on and how rewarding, how satisfying the reward is, determines whether or not you're able to bear it. And again, labor's a good example, because what gets a woman through that experience is knowing not only will it one day end, or not one day, hopefully in a few hours end, not only will it end, but this woman's faith will be rewarded by sight. Her faith, I'm having a baby, will be rewarded with sight, I am a mother. And that's true of the church. That one day your faith will be rewarded. This cave of pain will, if you keep pressing into it, turn into a tunnel and you'll see light at the other end. Christ will return for his bride, for his people. When it will be revealed to the world, you don't dwell on the earth. You dwell in heaven. That's what we read actually, where it said this in the start of chapter 14. And I'll end with this. John says, then I looked, and there was the Lamb. Not a lamb that sounds like a dragon, but the Lamb. And he was standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000. And that number, again, is a symbolic number. In the Old Testament, there were 12 tribes of Israelites. 12 times 12, it's 144, which represents God's people, Jew and Gentile throughout history. And it's 12 times 12 cubed, 144,000. And the cubing is significant because at the end of the book, we're going to see the people of God descending like a cube out of the sky. So it's a symbolic number that is meant to represent all of God's people. He says, I saw that God's people, and they had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. Because you've been branded, you've been marked. If you're a Christian, it's not the mark of the beast, but it's the mark of the Lamb. And we needn't get hung up about this idea of markings either, because we use that metaphorically all the time. We say, oh, you're a marked man. We say that. There's no reason why we should think it's referring to a literal mark, but the Lamb has marked you out and said, you're mine. So you can brand your car with a fish, if you like. You can put heaven bound on your bumper sticker or not. What matters, church, is that you know he's marked you out and he's taking you to be with him, your home with him in glory for eternity, when your faith will be sight.